r/TrueOffMyChest. Mechanic tried to scam me for $3,000. I'm certified. Hashtag chunk 1. The moment I walked into Riverside Auto Repair, I knew something was off. Not because of anything obvious, the shop looked clean enough, the waiting area had decent furniture, and the owner, a heavy-set man in his late 50s with a name tag reading Frank, greeted me with an oily smile. No, I knew something was off because I've worked in enough shops to recognize the particular energy of a place that doesn't operate on the level. I'd made the mistake of stopping here instead of driving 30 minutes back to the dealership where I work. My mom's old Subaru, my car today while I'm visiting my parents, had been making a slightly rough idle. Nothing serious. I checked it myself that morning and suspected it was just a dirty fuel injector, maybe some carbon buildup on the intake valves. A $150 to $200 problem, tops. Quick service, and I could get back to my parents' house for dinner. What brings you in today, sweetheart? Frank asked, his eyes doing a quick scan of my body that made my skin crawl. I was wearing jeans, a hoodie, and minimal makeup, not that it should matter, but it was clearly registering with him that I was a woman, and in his mind, that meant something very specific. The car's running rough, I said, keeping my voice neutral. Just the idle. Probably needs a fuel injector cleaning. Frank chuckled. Actually chuckled. Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Why don't you let me take a look? I've been doing this for 32 years. I handed over the keys and watched him walk the Subaru into the bay. While he was gone, I noticed the waiting area's magazine collection, all outdated, all focused on home and garden or generic lifestyle topics. The kind of magazines you'd see in a doctor's office from 2008. The TV mounted on the wall was tuned to a daytime talk show, volume muted. Everything about this place screamed designed for people who won't ask questions. 20 minutes later, Frank came back with the expression of a man who'd just discovered buried treasure. Okay, so I've got some concerning news, he said, pulling up a stool and sitting down with the kind of theatrical seriousness doctors reserve for terminal diagnoses. Your engine is in really bad shape. I mean, I'm surprised you made it here safely. My stomach tightened. Not with worry about the car, I knew exactly what condition my engine was in, but with anger. I kept my face carefully blank. How bad? I asked, channeling the voice of every person I'd seen come into our dealership genuinely frightened about their vehicle. Your engine needs a complete rebuild. We're talking about getting the whole thing apart, replacing rings, honing the cylinders, new gaskets, the works. You've got metal shavings in your oil. You're looking at probably $2,800 to $3,200 for parts and labor. The lie hung in the air between us like cigarette smoke. I'd checked my own oil that morning. I'm a certified ASE mechanic, all 8 specialties, thank you very much, and I maintain my own vehicle. The oil was clean. The car had 89,000 miles on it and regular service records. There were no metal shavings. There was no reason for an engine rebuild. Metal shavings? I repeated softly, playing the role of the concerned woman who knows just enough to be scared but not enough to ask the right questions. Yeah, which is typical when you neglect your maintenance. He said this with the confidence of someone who delivered this exact speech 100 times. How often do you get your oil changed? Every 5,000 miles, I said, which was true. Well, sometimes that's not enough, depending on driving conditions. How long have you owned this vehicle? About 4 years, I lied. I've owned this car for 7 years. Frank nodded knowingly. And you bought it used? Yes. That's the problem right there. You don't know what happened to it before you got it. The previous owner probably ran it into the ground. He stood up, brushing his hands together like he'd already mentally moved past my car onto the next one. I can get started on it Monday if you want. I'll need it for about 4 days. 4 days. $4,000. And I'd bet my ASE certifications that if he actually opened up that engine, he wouldn't find a damn thing wrong with it. Let me think about it, I said, my mind already racing. Can I call you? Sure thing, honey. But I wouldn't wait too long. Driving on an engine like that, you're one bad day away from a catastrophic failure. Could strand you on the highway, could be dangerous. Especially for someone driving alone. There it was. The implication that a woman driving alone should be extra nervous, extra cautious, extra likely to make a decision out of fear rather than reason. The gendered manipulation was so blatant it almost took my breath away. I nodded slowly, the way I'd imagined my mother would nod. My mother, who loves her car and trusts mechanics implicitly because she genuinely doesn't understand engines. My mother, who is exactly the kind of person this man would target. I'll definitely think about it, I repeated. Can I get your card? Frank handed me a business card for Riverside Auto Repair. The edges were slightly bent, worn from being handed out repeatedly. On the back, he'd written his cell phone number in blue pen. Call me anytime, he said. And really, don't delay. Safety first, you know? As I drove away from the shop, my hands were shaking with anger. Not because I was scared about my car. Not because I'd fallen for the scam. But because I kept thinking about my parents, who lived just 5 minutes from the shop. I thought about my mother's blind trust in authority figures. I thought about my father's assumption that he wouldn't understand the technical details anyway, so he might as well trust the expert. I thought about how many people like them Frank had probably scammed. And I made a decision. Hashtag chunk 2. I didn't call Frank that night. Instead, I did what any reasonable person in my position would do. I went full investigator mode. Over dinner with my parents, I casually asked if they'd ever taken their cars to Riverside Auto Repair. My mom's face lit up. Oh yes. Frank is wonderful. So thorough. Last year he told me my transmission was failing and... How much did that cost? I interrupted, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. $2,400, my dad answered, which is when my mom added quietly, but then we never had the problem he said we were going to have. I kept thinking maybe he fixed it without having to do the full replacement. I set down my fork very carefully. Did he show you the transmission fluid? Did he explain what he was seeing? My parents exchanged that particular look that middle-aged children come to dread, the one that says they know they might be being taken advantage of but feel too embarrassed to admit it, and too exhausted to fight about it now. He seemed very confident, my mom said softly. After dinner, I excused myself and went upstairs to the guest bedroom, where I pulled up my laptop and did what I should have done before even entering Frank's shop. I googled Riverside Auto Repair. The Better Business Bureau listing was a dumpster fire. 47 complaints in the last 3 years. 47. The patterns were immediately obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. Asterisk told me my engine was failing, quoted $3,200 rebuild. Took it to another mechanic, they said nothing was wrong. Asterisk. Asterisk Frank said I needed new brake lines. Took the car to another shop, and they said the brakes were fine. Asterisk. Asterisk elderly mother was quoted $1,800 for transmission work. Never got a second opinion, but it seemed high. Asterisk. Asterisk scam. Do not go here. Asterisk. And on and on. But here's what made my blood boil. The complaints had received responses. Frank's responses. And they were masterpieces of gaslighting. Asterisk we stand behind our diagnostic work. If the customer chose to take their vehicle elsewhere, that's their choice, but our techs are ASC certified and our diagnostics are accurate. We can't control what other shops tell customers. Asterisk. I checked his ASC certified techs. I found one name mentioned in a Yelp review. A quick search of the ASC database came back empty. Either that tech didn't exist or Frank was lying about their credentials, which, ironically, is the exact thing I was about to be accused of if I went public with mine. But the BBB wasn't the only place with complaints. I found reviews scattered across Google, Yelp, and a local community Facebook group for my parents' town. The same story, over and over again. And a significant portion of the victims appeared to be elderly or women, or both. One post from a woman named Margaret Chin caught my eye specifically. Posted 6 months ago. Asterisk my 74-year-old mother went to Riverside for an oil change. They told her she needed a complete brake overhaul for $1,600. I'm a nurse and I took her car to my mechanic. Brakes are perfect. When I called to confront Frank, he got aggressive and told me I didn't know what I was talking about. Don't trust this place. Asterisk. Margaret's profile was public. On impulse, I sent her a message. By the time I fell asleep that night, she'd already responded. The next morning, I met Margaret at a coffee shop near my parents' house. She was in her mid-40s, with tired eyes and the kind of determined energy that comes from protecting someone you love. Thank you for meeting me, I said, sitting down across from her with my latte. Are you a customer he scammed? She asked directly, no preamble. Worse, I said. I'm an ASC certified mechanic. All 8 specialties. He tried to sell me a $3,000 engine rebuild on a perfectly healthy car. Margaret's eyes widened. All 8? Do you know how rare that is? Not very, but it requires work, I said. The point is, I know the difference between a real problem and fiction. And Margaret, I think your mother isn't his only elderly victim. I showed her my research. The BBB complaints. The pattern. The suspicious consistency in his pricing, always in that $1,800 to $3,200 range. Always catastrophic failures. Always a sense of urgency. I've been thinking about making some calls, I said carefully. To the Better Business Bureau, maybe a local news station if they'd be interested. But I want to do this right. I don't want to come across as some disgruntled customer with a vendetta. And honestly, I'm worried about the liability of claiming expertise if he pushes back. Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying me. You're worried he'll say you're lying about your certifications. It's not impossible, I admitted. He could claim I'm just an angry customer making things up. My word against his, and he's got 32 years of business history. I've got 8 online certifications. Not just online, Margaret said. You could bring the certificates. Physical proof. I could, I agreed. But the moment I go public with this, I'm also putting my own dealership on the line. My boss finds out I went to a competitor shop and then turned around and publicly called out another mechanic. It could look bad. Would your dealership care? I thought about this honestly. I don't know. Probably not officially. But unofficially? In a small town? People talk. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, my mother gave Frank her savings. Not all of it, but she transferred $8,000 to his account because he told her that brake failure could kill her. She couldn't sleep for 2 weeks, waiting for that appointment. Do you know what that does to someone? I felt something shift in my chest. When did this happen? I asked. 5 months ago. The brakes were fine. He tried to convince her to do additional work while she was there. She called me in a panic before going back, and that's when I checked. Margaret's jaw tightened. He refunded half of it when I pushed back. He told my mother it was a diagnostic fee that wasn't refundable. My mother was humiliated. She's been depressed about it ever since. I'm going to shut him down, I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. But even as the words left my mouth, I was aware of the complications. The dominoes that would fall. The ways this could go sideways. The professional risk I was taking by attaching my name to this. And underneath all of that, something darker, the question of how far I was willing to go, and whether I was doing this for justice or for revenge. Margaret reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Let me help, she said. I'll talk to my mother. I'll reach out to other people who posted about him. If this is going to work, you need witnesses. Real people, willing to go on record. I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of what I was committing to. Okay, I said. Then let's do it right. Hashtag Chunk 3. Over the next week, Margaret became my unofficial partner in what I'd started thinking of as Operation Expose Frank. We met twice more, once at the same coffee shop, once at a park where we sat on a bench and pretended to be 2 old friends catching up, because I was becoming genuinely paranoid about being seen together. It probably wasn't necessary. Frank had no reason to think I was doing anything other than what I'd told him, thinking about whether to authorize the $3,000 repair. Margaret was methodical. She created a shared document, encrypted, shared through a secure link, where she began reaching out to people who'd posted complaints online. Some were harder to track down than others. Some never responded. But others did, and their stories started to form a pattern so clear it was almost textbook predatory behavior. There was Donald Pacheco, 76, who'd been quoted $2,800 for a transmission rebuild that, when he took it to another shop, was deemed perfectly functional. There was the widow, Patricia Simmons, whose late husband's vehicle Frank had worked on extensively. After Patricia's daughter reviewed the invoices, she found charges for repairs on parts that had been replaced just 6 months before. There was a younger woman, Keisha, who'd gone in for a simple coolant flush and walked out having authorized $1,900 in urgent suspension work. What struck me most wasn't just that the amounts were high. It was the urgency Frank created. Every single victim reported that he'd emphasized how dangerous their situation was. How their brakes could fail. How their engine could seize. How they could hurt themselves or someone else. He weaponized fear, and he did it with the precision of someone who'd perfected the technique. Margaret sent me a message on Thursday, *I have 7 people willing to provide statements. One has documentation. Are you ready? I wasn't. Not yet. The problem was the dealership. I'd been going back and forth about whether to tell my boss, Derek, what I was planning. The ethical part of me said I should. The practical part of me understood that even though my boss would probably support exposing fraud, there was a universe where this blew back on me professionally. Where I was seen as someone who aired dirty laundry in the industry. Where people whispered that I was a snitch. But there was another complication I hadn't fully anticipated, responsibility. By Friday morning, I'd realized that once I went public, and I would go public, I was essentially offering myself up as an expert witness. News outlets would want quotes. The Better Business Bureau would want detailed information. If this escalated to law enforcement or civil court, I could be called to testify. I'd be the face of this operation. Which meant everyone would know exactly who I was, where I worked, and what I'd done. My dealership's name would be all over it. That's when I decided I had to tell Derek. I waited until after lunch on Friday, when the dealership was less chaotic. Derek was in his office, reviewing something on his computer. He looked up when I knocked, his reading glasses sliding down his nose. Hey, Sarah. What's up? I closed the door behind me. Derek's expression changed immediately. The casual friendliness shifted into alert attention. In my 4 years at the dealership, I'd rarely come to him with the door closed. I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen completely before you react, I said. It's not about work. It's not about my performance. But it might indirectly affect the dealership, so you deserve to know. He took his glasses off and leaned back in his chair. Okay. I'm listening. I told him everything. The visit to Riverside Auto Repair. My discovery. The BBB complaints. Margaret and her mother. The pattern of elderly and female victims. The fake certifications. All of it. I watched his expression darken as I talked, especially when I mentioned that I'd been researching this throughout the week. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. You're planning to go public with this, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, I said. I have to. This man is committing fraud against vulnerable people in my parents' community. One of his victims is a woman who's been depressed because she's out $4,000 and feels humiliated. There are elderly people who are terrified their cars are going to break down because Frank convinced them they're on the edge of catastrophic failure. Derek rubbed his face. Okay. First question, can you prove your credentials beyond doubt? Because once you go public, that's going to be the first thing he attacks. I have my ASE certifications. All 8. I can provide the numbers, registration, everything. It's verifiable. Good. Second question, are you prepared for the blowback? Not just from Frank, but from customers? From people in the industry? There are mechanics who will see this as one of us throwing another one of us under the bus. I hadn't wanted to think about that, but I'd known it was inevitable. I know, I said quietly. But he's not actually one of us if he's doing this. Mechanics are supposed to maintain a code. What Frank is doing violates every principle I learned in my certifications. Derek nodded slowly. You're right. He leaned forward. Have you talked to a lawyer? That stopped me. What? Before you go to the media, before you make any official complaints, talk to a lawyer. This is defamation territory if you're not careful. You need to make sure everything you say is factual and documented. You need to understand the legal implications of being a witness in what might become a fraud case. And you need to protect yourself. Something in my chest loosened. Derek wasn't going to tell me to stop. He wasn't going to forbid me. He was giving me the advice I actually needed. Okay, I said. I'll find someone. Use the firm that handles our corporate stuff, Derek said. I'll call them and give them a heads up. Tell them you're coming and that it's urgent. They can probably see you Monday. He paused. And Sarah? What you're doing is right. It's scary and it's complicated, but it's right. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. I left his office feeling simultaneously lighter and heavier. The weight of what I was committing to had solidified into something real. That evening, I texted Margaret, *, let's plan the next steps. I'm going to talk to a lawyer Monday. After that, we move forward. Are you ready? *. Her response came almost immediately, ready. My mother is ready. All 7 of them are ready. We're going to stop him, Sarah. We're actually going to do this. *. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt the first real flicker of fear. Not about Frank or about legal complications. But about the person I was about to become once I crossed this line. There was no going back from this. #Chunk4. The law firm Derek connected me with was called Sterling & Associates, and they specialized in corporate liability and consumer protection cases. I got an appointment for Monday at 2 p.m., which gave me the weekend to spiral quietly into worst-case scenarios. I spent Saturday researching defamation law on my laptop until my eyes hurt. The good news, truth is an absolute defense. If everything I said about Frank was factually accurate, he couldn't successfully sue me for libel. The bad news, factually accurate, is a lot harder to prove than it sounds, especially when you're dealing with subjective interpretations of his statements and motivations. I could say Frank told me my engine needed a complete rebuild when it didn't. That's provable. But if I said Frank is a predator who deliberately targets vulnerable people, that crossed into territory that required demonstrating intent and pattern, which meant I needed the documentation Margaret had mentioned. I needed the statements. I needed airtight evidence. By Sunday afternoon, I'd worked myself into a knot of anxiety. I went to my parents' house for dinner, hoping the distraction would help. My mom had made lasagna, which was her answer to everything, and my dad was in a good mood because the weather had been nice for his garden. I sat at their kitchen table and didn't tell them that I was about to potentially blow up a mechanic's business based on evidence I gathered from strangers. I didn't tell them that I'd been secretly investigating the shop I visited just a week ago while they watched me eat and asked about work. You seem quiet, my mom said, refilling my wine glass. Everything okay at the dealership? Fine, I said, which was technically true. Just tired. My dad, oblivious to subtext as always, launched into a story about his tomato plants. I let the words wash over me and tried not to think about Patricia Simmons, whose late husband had trusted Frank with his vehicle, or Donald Pacheco, who'd been terrified to drive his car until he found out it was perfectly fine. These were the people I was fighting for. And yet, sitting at my parents' table, it felt surreal. Abstract. Like I was playing a part in a story that someone else had written. Monday morning came too fast. Sterling and Associates occupied the entire 15th floor of a glass building downtown. I'd dressed in business casual, slacks and a blazer, wanting to look credible without looking like I was trying too hard. The receptionist directed me to conference room B, where I met with a lawyer named Victoria Chin. She was in her 50s, with sharp eyes and the kind of direct manner that immediately made me feel like I'd made the right choice. I told her everything. The visit to Riverside Auto. The suspiciously high quote. My credentials. The pattern Margaret and I had uncovered. The 7 victims willing to provide statements. Victoria took notes in a leather-bound notebook, her pen moving steadily as I talked. When I finished, she set the pen down and looked at me over her glasses. Here's what you need to understand, she said. You're not just exposing fraud. You're potentially opening yourself up to several different legal scenarios. The most obvious is that Frank could attempt to sue you for defamation. That's probably his weakest play if you stick to provable facts, but he might do it anyway just to create legal costs and headaches for you. More concerning is the possibility of a tortious interference claim. He could argue that you're deliberately damaging his business. But I'm just telling the truth, I said. Yes. And truth is a defense. But you still have to defend yourself, which costs money and time. The other scenario is that law enforcement gets involved. If fraud is being committed, they might open an investigation. At that point, you could be called as a witness. You'd need to provide all your documentation, be prepared to testify, potentially face cross-examination from Frank's lawyer. My stomach tightened. Okay. Before you go to the media or file any formal complaints, I need you to gather everything. All the conversations with Frank. Photos or records of that initial quote. Everything Margaret has collected from other victims. I need documentation, timestamps, and corroborating evidence. And I need you to understand that once you go public, you can't control the narrative. You can't take it back. I know, I said, though I wasn't sure I actually did. One more thing, Victoria said, leaning back in her chair. Do you have any idea how Frank might respond? Is he the type to get aggressive? To retaliate? I hadn't really thought about that in concrete terms. I don't know. You should think about it. Not to scare you, but to prepare you. Some people, when cornered, escalate. They might try to find information on you. They might show up at your workplace. They might post their own statements online trying to discredit you before you can discredit them. He doesn't know what I'm doing, I said. Not yet. But word travels fast, especially in tight communities. And if you involve the media, there will be a story published with your name and face. That's going to be a flashpoint. I left her office with a 15-page document outlining my rights, potential outcomes, and recommended next steps. My head was pounding. That evening, I texted Margaret, met with a lawyer. She says we need to have everything perfectly documented before we go public. When can we meet this week to go through all the statements? Margaret's response came back within minutes. Wednesday night? My place? I'll have all the documentation there. I agreed and spent the next 2 days at work feeling like I was living a double life. I diagnosed cars and reviewed service records and made small talk with customers, all while my mind was running scenarios of what could go wrong. By Wednesday, I was running on anxiety and caffeine. Margaret's house was small and neat, with a kind of carefully maintained interior that suggested someone who took pride in their space. She'd laid out all the documentation on her dining room table, printed emails, handwritten statements, copies of invoices, photos of work orders. It was more extensive than I'd realized. More damning, too. I've been collecting this for 3 years, Margaret said quietly. Ever since my mother went to Frank and came home saying he told her she needed $3,200 in brake work. My daughter is a mechanic too, not certified like you, but she knows cars. She looked at my mother's car and said the brakes were fine. That's when I started asking questions. Started talking to other people. I looked through the statements. Each one was detailed. Names, dates, amounts, what was quoted versus what was actually wrong with the vehicles. One woman had taken her car to a second shop after Frank's quote, and the second shop had documented that 90% of what Frank had recommended was unnecessary. This is good, I said. This is really good. But Margaret, I need you to understand something. Once this goes public, your name is going to be attached to it. People might blame you for trying to destroy a local business. It might get ugly. She met my eyes. I know. My mother knows too. We've talked about it. We want to do this. I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of responsibility settle heavier on my shoulders. Okay, I said. Let's schedule the media interview. #Chunk5. The local news station I contacted was a mid-sized operation that covered the greater metropolitan area. Their investigative segment, Spotlight on Fraud, had a decent reputation for thorough reporting. When I called the main line and asked for the producer, I expected to get transferred around or left in voicemail purgatory. Instead, I got Marcus Chen, who seemed genuinely interested the moment I mentioned mechanic fraud targeting elderly residents. Can you come in tomorrow? He asked. That was faster than I'd anticipated. I thought there would be more back and forth, more vetting. Victoria's warnings echoed in my head about not being able to control the narrative once it went public. But Margaret and I had the documentation. We had 7 statements. We had a pattern 3 years in the making. We were as prepared as we were going to get. Yes, I said. Tomorrow works. That night, I called Victoria to let her know what was happening. Tomorrow, she said, and I could hear the sharp intake of breath even through the phone. That's very fast. Did you sign anything with the news station? Not yet. We're just meeting to discuss the story. When you do meet with them, don't sign anything without sending it to me first. And listen carefully, once you're on camera, you need to be extremely measured in your language. Stick to facts. Don't speculate about Frank's motivations or character. Let the evidence speak for itself. I understand, I said. But I wasn't entirely sure I did. Sitting in my apartment at midnight, I kept thinking about what Victoria had said about Frank potentially retaliating. What if he heard about this before the story aired? What if he went public with his own version first? What if he claimed I was a disgruntled customer with an axe to grind? What if he dug into my background and found something, anything, he could use to discredit me? I texted Margaret, having second thoughts? The response came back almost immediately, no. Are you? Terrified, I replied. Good. That means you're taking it seriously. Tomorrow we finish this. Thursday morning came wrapped in gray clouds. I called in sick to the dealership, ironic, given that I told Margaret I was tired when I was really having a minor existential crisis. My manager didn't even ask questions. Take care of yourself, she said. The news station occupied a nondescript building in a commercial park. Marcus Chen met me in the lobby, a man in his 40s with an easy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He looked like someone who'd seen enough human dysfunction to not be surprised by anything. Margaret was already in the small waiting area. She looked like she hadn't slept either. Marcus walked us into a conference room and closed the door. Before we go any further, I want to be clear about how this works, he said, sitting across from us. We do our own investigation. We contact Frank Riverside for comment. We verify everything you told us independently. If we can't corroborate your claims, we don't run the story. I don't care how compelling it is. We have legal obligations, and we take them seriously. That's fine, I said. It's also going to take time. We're probably looking at 2 to 3 weeks minimum. Maybe longer if Frank fights back or if we discover anything that contradicts your narrative. 2 to 3 weeks. In that time, Frank could find out what was coming. In that time, anything could happen. We understand, Margaret said. Marcus pulled out a notepad. Walk me through this. Start from the beginning. I told him everything again. The visit to Riverside Auto. The condescending tone. The excessive quote. My realization that I was being scammed. He took notes, asked clarifying questions, and occasionally looked at Margaret, who filled in the history of her own investigation. When we got to the statements from other customers, Marcus's expression sharpened. You have these with you? Margaret pulled out a folder. 7 printed statements, each one signed and dated. Marcus flipped through them slowly, reading each one carefully. These are typed up, he said. Who typed them? I did, Margaret admitted. The customers provided them handwritten, but I asked permission to type them up for clarity. All of them have the original handwritten versions too, if you need them. I will need them, Marcus said. For verification purposes. And I'll need to contact each of these people directly to confirm they actually wrote those statements. Some of them might not want to go on camera. That's okay, Margaret said. We have documentation of the other repairs they sought after going to Frank. This was why I'd come to her first. She'd been methodical about this in a way I would never have been. Marcus closed the folder. Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to assign this to one of our investigative reporters, Jen Martinez. She's excellent at this kind of work. She'll contact the victims independently. She'll take their cars to a mechanic we vetted for a second opinion on Frank's original recommendations. She'll request Frank's response. And she'll look into whether there have been any complaints filed with the State Board or the Better Business Bureau. There have been complaints, Margaret said quietly. At least 2 formal ones with the BBB. Marcus's eyebrows rose slightly. And Frank's still in business? The complaints were filed separately, years apart. The business owners didn't connect them as part of a pattern. Okay, Marcus said. He looked at me. I need to ask you something directly. Is there any possibility that Frank could argue you're doing this out of personal motivation? That you're trying to damage a competitor's business? No, I said. I work at a Lexus dealership. Frank runs an independent shop. We're not competitors. Any personal history with him? No. I'd never met him before I took my car there. Marcus nodded. And you're ASE certified? Yes. I can provide documentation of that as well. Please do. He stood up. I'm going to be honest with both of you. If this checks out the way you're describing it, this is a significant story. Fraud targeting elderly people is something our audience cares about. But it's also the kind of story that can blow back hard. Frank could claim you're part of a coordinated attack. He could try to discredit you both publicly. He could lawyer up and fight aggressively. I've been warned, I said. Good. Because I want to make sure you're both prepared for what comes next. Once this airs, your lives are going to change. People will know your names. People will have opinions about you. Not all of them will be kind. I thought of my parents. I thought of my mom asking if everything was okay, and me lying. I thought of what would happen when they saw me on the news talking about fraud and deception. We're ready, Margaret said, and I nodded in agreement. But I wasn't sure if either of us actually was. #Chunk6 The investigation moved faster than Marcus had warned, but not in the way I'd hoped. By Friday afternoon, less than 24 hours after our meeting with Marcus, my phone rang. It was my mother. Honey, are you okay? Her voice had that particular pitch it got when she was worried, the one that made me feel like I was 12 years old again and had scraped my knee. My stomach dropped. Mom, what's wrong? Nothing's wrong, Frank Riverside called your father. He said he wanted to reach out to the family about some misunderstandings regarding your recent visit to his shop. He was very strange about it. Very insistent. I sat down on my couch. What did Dad say? He told Frank that if he had a problem, he should talk to you directly. But honey, that was an odd call to get. Why would he be calling us? I couldn't tell her. Not yet. Not like this. It's nothing, Mom. Just a business thing. I'll handle it. Are you sure? Because he asked a lot of questions about whether you'd been talking to anyone else about your car. He seemed very interested in who you'd been talking to. The back of my neck went cold. He asked you that? Well, not directly. But he was asking about your friends, whether Margaret had been in touch with you recently, things like that. It felt intrusive. Margaret. He'd already connected the dots to Margaret. After I hung up with my mom, promising everything was fine, knowing it wasn't, I immediately texted Margaret. Frank called my parents. He knows something is happening. The response came back after a minute. Call me. How did he figure it out? Margaret asked the moment I had her on the phone. We were both trying to keep our voices low even though neither of us had anyone listening. I don't know. Maybe one of the people who gave you a statement said something? Maybe he's just being proactive? Or maybe he started digging into you, Margaret said. That's what they do, these kinds of operators. When they sense something's wrong, they get aggressive. They try to get ahead of the narrative. I'd been afraid of this, but hearing it confirmed made my hands shake. Victoria said he might retaliate. We need to tell Marcus, Margaret said. This is actually good in a way. It shows consciousness of guilt. It shows he knows he's vulnerable. It also shows he's watching, I said. Waiting. Trying to figure out what we're doing. Then we move faster. We push Marcus to accelerate the investigation. I called Marcus's direct line from the news station. He picked up on the third ring. Frank Riverside called my parents, I said without preamble. Within 24 hours of our meeting. He was asking questions about my social contacts, specifically about Margaret. There was a pause. I could hear Marcus thinking. Okay, he said. That's actually helpful information. When did this call happen? This afternoon. Maybe 3 hours ago. And what exactly did he say? I relayed the conversation as my mother had described it. Marcus made small sounds of acknowledgement as I talked. This is good, he said when I finished. This shows awareness. This shows concern on his part. But it also means we need to move carefully and quickly. If he suspects something's happening, he might try to coach his victims, get them to recant, or destroy documentation. So what do? We accelerate. I'm going to have Jen start making contact with the victims today instead of waiting until Monday. We'll do the independent verification of his work immediately. And we contact Frank for comment sooner rather than later. Once we reach out to him officially, it puts him on notice that this is a real investigation, not just a rumor. How long? I asked. 1 week, maybe 10 days, if everything cooperates. If Frank fights back, longer. But we'll have the story locked down before the end of next week either way. 1 week. Frank had 1 week to realize what was coming and do whatever he was going to do. After I hung up with Marcus, I sat with my phone in my hands for a long time, staring at nothing. I should tell my parents the truth. I should prepare them for what was coming. But I also couldn't. Not yet. Not while the investigation was still active and there was a possibility, however small, that something could go wrong. Instead, I called Victoria. He's already moving, I told her. He called my parents. He's trying to figure out what I'm doing. Of course he is, Victoria said, and she sounded almost calm about it. This is predictable behavior. He's scared, so he's poking around, trying to gather intelligence. It's aggressive, but it's also reactive. What if he tries to contact me directly? Document everything. Every call, every text, every email. Save it all. If he makes threats, you report it. If he tries to intimidate you, you document it. And you don't engage with him beyond polite refusal to talk. What if he tries to get me fired? Victoria was quiet for a moment. Has he threatened your job? Not yet. Then we'll handle it if it happens. But listen to me, you need to stay calm and focused. You're doing the right thing. The only thing that matters now is telling the truth. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bed with my phone on my chest, waiting for another call that didn't come. I thought about Frank in his shop, going through his day, maybe starting to realize that his world was about to collapse. I thought about the customers he'd stolen from, Margaret, the elderly couples, the single mothers who trusted him with their cars and their money. I thought about my parents, who still didn't know what their daughter was about to become in the eyes of the public. By Saturday morning, I'd made a decision. I needed to tell them before the story broke. I needed to give them warning. I couldn't protect them from what was coming, but I could at least not let them hear it from someone else. I called and asked if I could come over for lunch. Of course, sweetheart, my mother said immediately. Is everything okay? We need to talk, I said. All three of us. Together. And I need you to hear what I have to say before you react. I could feel her hesitation even through the phone. Now you're scaring me. It's going to be okay, I said, hoping I was telling the truth. But I owe you both an explanation. And it's a long one. #Chunk7. The drive to my parents' house felt longer than it had in years. Every red light was an eternity. Every mile of highway stretched out like it was deliberately trying to delay the inevitable. I'd rehearsed what I was going to say approximately 400 times since I'd hung up with my mom Saturday morning. None of it sounded right. None of it sounded like the truth told by someone who had her life together. I was a 28-year-old woman with a good job, an ASE certification hanging on my apartment wall, and a reputation in my field as someone who was competent and reliable. I was not supposed to be the person who went on a crusade to expose fraud. I was supposed to be someone who went to work, did her job, and minded her own business. That was what responsible people did. Except I'd already stopped being that person the moment I'd sat down across from Frank Riverside and let him talk down to me like I was nobody. My parents' house looked exactly the same as it always did, the yellow shutters that my dad had been threatening to repaint for 3 years, the garden where my mom grew tomatoes that were somehow always better than anyone else's, the driveway where I'd learned to drive in my dad's old truck. It looked like safety. It looked like home. It also looked like the place where I was about to destroy their Saturday afternoon with the truth. My mom opened the door before I could knock, and I could see the concern written all over her face. She pulled me into a hug that lasted longer than usual, and I felt my resolve start to crack. "Come on," she said, pulling back to look at me. "Your father's in the living room. I made your favorite, that pasta salad you like." Of course she had. That was what my mother did. She made food when she was worried. She made comfort and carbohydrates and pretended everything was fine until someone told her it wasn't. My dad was sitting in his recliner with the television on low, some documentary about ancient Rome that he'd probably seen 3 times already. He turned it off and stood up when he saw me, which he never did. He was treating me like a guest, and that small gesture broke something in my chest. "All right," my mom said, settling onto the couch. "We're all here. You said it was important. You said we needed to hear something." I sat down on the edge of the armchair, my hands clasped so tightly together that my knuckles were white. I'd practiced this. I'd prepared. And yet all I could think was that I was about to change things, and not all of the changes would be good. "There's something I didn't tell you about my visit," I said. "When I came to see you last week. Something about why I took my car to Frank's shop." My mom's eyes widened slightly. My dad leaned forward. "Frank Riverside scammed me," I said, and the words came out like I was ripping them out of my own chest. "He told me my engine needed a complete rebuild for $3,000. My engine is fine. I'm ASE certified. I know cars. I know that my car is in perfect working order. He tried to defraud me, and when I called him out, well, when I was planning to call him out, I discovered he's been doing the same thing to other people. Elderly people. People in your neighborhood." The silence that followed was the kind that actually has weight to it. I watched my mother's face shift from concern to understanding to something like anger. My dad sat back slowly, his jaw clenching. "How do you know this?" my dad asked finally. "I met with a woman named Margaret Chin. She came to him with a similar problem. I reached out to a news reporter named Marcus, he works for Channel 7, and we've been working with him to investigate Frank's business practices. There's going to be a story. Probably by the end of next week. And my name is going to be in it." "Your name," my mom repeated. "On the news." "I'm going to be on camera," I said. "I'm going to talk about what happened to me, and about what I discovered about Frank's other victims. I'm going to use my credentials to explain why his claims about my car were fraudulent. And I wanted you to hear it from me first, before it's public." My dad stood up and walked to the window. He stood there with his back to me for a long moment, and I watched his shoulders rise and fall as he breathed. When he turned back around, his expression was complicated. I could see pride there, but also worry, and something that might have been anger. "How long have you been planning this?" he asked. "Since Tuesday. Since I left Frank's shop." "And you didn't tell us?" "No. I couldn't. The investigation needed to stay quiet. If Frank had known I was working with reporters, he might have," I paused, choosing my words carefully. "He might have done things to cover his tracks. He might have coached his victims to recant their stories. He might have destroyed evidence. But he called us," my mom said. "Last Friday. He was asking about you. About whether you'd been talking to anyone." I nodded. "He's already suspicious. He's already scared. Which means he knows what he's been doing is illegal." My dad came back and sat down, and he suddenly looked older than he had that morning. "Victoria warned you about retaliation," he said. "It wasn't a question. She did. But Victoria also said that what I'm doing is the right thing. And it is. Because Frank has scammed dozens of people. Because he specifically targets people like you, people who trust him, who might not know enough about cars to question his diagnosis, who are at an age where they might not want to spend the time dealing with fraud. You could have been hurt," my mom said quietly. "Going to his shop, pretending you didn't know anything. You could have," she stopped, but I knew what she was going to say. "You could have put yourself in danger." "I was careful," I said. "And I'm not in danger. This is just a business investigation. Frank is a con artist, but he's not dangerous. He's just a man who realized he could make money by lying to people." My dad rubbed his face. "When does the story air?" "End of next week. Maybe sooner if the investigation moves faster than expected." Marcus said 1 week, maybe 10 days. "And what happens after that?" "Frank's business probably closes. The Better Business Bureau will investigate. His customers might sue. He might face charges, depending on what the investigation uncovers. My name becomes public. People might have opinions about what I've done, not all of them kind." My dad was quiet. Then he reached over and squeezed my mom's hand. She was crying silently, tears running down her cheeks without sound. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner," I said. "But I needed to be sure before I dragged you into it. You should have trusted us," my mom said, and her voice was thick with emotion. "We're your parents. We should have known." "I know," I said. "And I'm sorry. But I'm telling you now. And I wanted you to know that I'm doing this because it's right, not because I was angry at Frank. I'm doing this because he's hurt people, and he's going to keep hurting people if someone doesn't stop him." My dad looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded, slowly. "Okay," he said. "Then we'll help however we can. #Chunk8, the truth comes out." The story aired on a Thursday evening at 6 o'clock. I watched it in the break room at the dealership, standing with my phone propped against my coffee mug while my coworkers pretended not to stare. The footage was professional. Marcus had done exactly what he promised. There was me, sitting in the news studio with my ASE certificates visible on the wall behind me, explaining in clear, technical language why Frank's diagnosis had been fraudulent. There was Margaret Chin talking about how Frank had pressured her into spending $2,800 on repairs her vehicle didn't need. There were 3 other elderly residents, all from my parents' neighborhood, all telling similar stories. And then there was footage of Frank's shop, with a banner across the front that read, "Closed pending investigation." I hadn't expected that part. Marcus must have gotten the closure order during the final hours of the story's production. It felt like watching dominoes fall in fast forward. My supervisor pulled me aside after my shift. He'd already known what was coming. I'd given him a heads up that morning, but seeing it actually happen seemed to land differently. "You did the right thing," he told me, and I realized I'd been holding my breath, waiting for someone official to say those words to me. "We've already had 3 customers call asking if we can review their recent repair bills from other shops. You probably prevented dozens of frauds just by going public." By Friday morning, the local Better Business Bureau had opened an official investigation into Frank Riverside's business practices. By Friday afternoon, a lawyer had called me to ask if I'd be willing to testify if Frank faced criminal charges. By Saturday, my parents' phone had rung so many times with neighbors thanking them that my mom finally just let it go to voicemail. The part nobody had really prepared me for was how personal it would become. I started getting messages on social media, not just from my own friends and colleagues, but from strangers. Some were supportive. "Thank you for protecting our community," they said. "You're a hero." Others were less kind. There were people who questioned whether I was a real mechanic. People who said I was grandstanding. People who claimed I'd probably just been a disgruntled customer with a grudge against Frank. There was one particularly nasty comment that suggested I'd probably made up the whole thing for attention. I stopped reading the comments after about 48 hours. What I didn't expect was to hear from Frank directly. He called my dealership on Monday morning, and my supervisor transferred him to me despite my explicit request that he be told I wasn't available. I almost hung up immediately, but something, curiosity, maybe, or some misguided sense of needing closure, made me listen. "You destroyed my business," Frank said, and he sounded less angry than he sounded broken. "Do you have any idea how many people I employed? Do you know what you've done?" "I know exactly what I've done," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I've exposed a pattern of fraud that you've been committing for years. I've protected people from being scammed by someone they trusted." "You're a liar," he spat. "I gave you an honest diagnosis. You came to my shop with a problem, and I told you what I found." "No," I said. "You came to a woman you thought didn't know anything about cars, and you lied to her. You told her something was broken when it wasn't. And you did it deliberately, knowing that most people wouldn't question you. The difference between you and me is that I actually know cars, Frank. I know them well enough to know you were lying. And I know them well enough to prove it." He hung up without another word. I reported the call to the police and to Marcus, who informed me that Frank's lawyer had already advised him to stop contacting me. Apparently, that was the least of Frank's problems. The investigation had uncovered 43 separate fraudulent repairs over a 3-year period. The total amount scammed from his victims came to over $170,000. The criminal charges came down 2 weeks later: fraud, conspiracy, and theft by deception. Frank's trial was scheduled for 6 months out. But the real victory didn't come in a courtroom. It came on a Saturday afternoon when my parents and I were at their favorite diner, and a woman approached our table. I recognized her immediately. It was Margaret Chin, the first victim I'd met with. "I wanted to thank you in person," she said to me, ignoring my parents' presence entirely. She was looking only at me. "The insurance company has agreed to reimburse me for those repairs. But that's not the main thing. The main thing is that I don't feel stupid anymore. I don't feel like I was foolish for trusting him. You made me understand that it wasn't my fault." After she left, my mom reached over and squeezed my hand. My dad ordered another round of coffee even though he'd already had 3 cups. "I was wrong," my dad said finally. "When you first told us, I thought you were taking on something too big, something too risky. But you were right. You knew what you were doing." I was terrified, I admitted. I still am, sometimes. People are still angry. There are still people who think I'm a liar or an attention seeker or whatever else they want to believe. "That's the nature of doing the right thing," my mom said. "It's not always popular. It's not always safe. But it's right." The conversation with my parents stayed with me over the following weeks. I went back to work, back to the routine of diagnosing and fixing vehicles. But something fundamental had shifted inside me. I'd stepped into the light when I could have stayed in the shadows. I'd used my voice when I could have stayed silent. Frank Riverside's trial took place on a cold Tuesday in March. The courtroom was packed with his victims and their families. I sat in the witness stand and answered questions about my credentials, my expertise, and the deliberate deception I'd encountered at his shop. My voice didn't shake. My hands didn't tremble. I'd been building toward this moment since the day he'd looked me in the eye and lied. He was convicted on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 2 years in prison and ordered full restitution to his victims. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt lighter than I had in months. Victoria met me at the bottom of the steps with a smile and said, "You did good." I had. I knew that now with a certainty that no amount of negative comments or angry messages could shake. I'd done something that mattered. I protected my community. I'd given voice to people who had been silenced by shame and confusion. That was what responsible people did. They did the right thing, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard.